I'm venturing to guess that many people in the audience love their high school experience. Well, I'm someone who loved my high school experience. I went to the High School for the Performing and Visual Arts in Houston. It was really a special school in many ways. First and foremost, it was a public arts magnet high school, meaning it was arts themed, and I took art classes half the day and academics the other half of the day. But it was more than that. The whole school was a very loving and quirky community of artists. Overall, I feel like I really found myself in high school, and my high school experience was one of the most fun and transformative of my entire life. However, I think it's important to take a step back from my individual experience and look at my high school through a more societal lens. As I mentioned, HSPVA is a magnet school. Broadly defined, magnet schools are public schools with specialized curricula that anyone in the district can apply to. And in the 1970s, they were conceptualized to combat school segregation. I mentioned this last point, which isn't normally part of the definition, because I didn't know this was true. Today, magnet schools seem to do everything but desegregate. Let's take a look at my high school, for example. As you can see, HSPVA, represented in blue, has nearly 50% of students who are white compared to the rest of the school district in red. HSPVA students are 100% gifted and talented compared to the near 10% in the district. And the district has many more students who are economically disadvantaged. In summary, despite its original desegregation purposes, HSPVA has a disproportionate share of students who are white, wealthy, and gifted and talented. This created a personal struggle for me, to benefit from students' structural expense. I felt especially hypocritical because in high school, I was an education activist, and I actively fought against charter schools and school choice. But I neglected to apply the same scrutiny to my own school, a choice school. In a recent press release, the Magnet Schools of America called magnets the happy medium of the polarized education debate. But is that hypocritical as well? There's a great discrepancy here between the original mission of magnet schools and their current effects, between my personal experience and the greater societal realities. This left me with some burning questions. What happened to magnet schools that they strayed so far from their original mission of desegregation? Do only privileged people like myself benefit from magnet schools? And are magnet schools still an attractive option? How do they fit within the current school choice debate? For my research, here's what I found. Our education system has been experiencing widespread privatization since the 1980s, and thus magnet schools have been pressured to be more selective and their original mission was lost. I identified two primary changes in the selectivity of magnet schools, abandoning desegregation and this phenomenon known as skimming, that caused these inequalities seen in my high school and beyond. Last, I assert a call to action for magnet schools to refocus on desegregation. From here, let's start with a brief history of magnet schools. It all started with the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board in 1954 that I'm sure you've heard of. The court ruled school segregation is unconstitutional, a decision that jump-started forced desegregation plans that were overseen by the courts. Thus, magnet schools are born as one of these strategies. The idea was to get students from all different segregated neighborhoods to come to these attractive magnet schools that had some fun themes like arts, STEM, language, Montessori, etc. The concept exploded, especially because these programs were government supported. As you can see here, magnet schools have proliferated since the 1980s, and they continue to be popular. Today, there are over 4,300 magnet schools that serve nearly 3.5 million students. However, magnet schools look very different than they once did. This change is directly related to the privatization of education, which is still strongly supported today. The dramatic shift has its origins in this 1983 report called A Nation at Risk from the Reagan administration. Under this, the U.S. was declared not adequately preparing its students to be an internationally competitive workforce. This launched waves of education reform, especially those that emphasize the free market principles of competition and innovation. The most famous of these you've probably heard of is the school choice movement. School choice is the idea that education should give power back to original families instead of the government. That students should have the opportunity to escape their failing public school that they're zoned to. Choice advocates assert that allowing students to attend schools beyond their segregated neighborhoods will reduce segregation. As state funding for public schools has been stagnating, In contrast, there are lots of wealthy, powerful people pouring money into school choice, some of here whom you might recognize. Now, let's take a look at how this movement and privatization affected magnet schools specifically. With the privatization movement gaining momentum, federal courts began releasing their oversight of these desegregation plans, including magnet schools, in the 1990s, but here each individual school is represented by year zero. As you can see, these desegregation plans were working. Schools were becoming more integrated. Yet, after the courts released their oversight and these plans were abandoned, then massive resegregation occurred. And of course, these inequalities extend far beyond race. One of the biggest criticisms of magnet schools is they so-called skim the cream, or skim the top students from neighborhood public schools into magnet schools and neglect low-performing students. These top-performing, oversubscribed, highly selective magnet schools are competing with neighborhood schools for this cream. In fact, the so-called theme of many top magnet schools is actually just a fancy way of saying a school for smart students, as you can see from some of these schools. School for the talented and gifted, academic magnet, preparatory school. Sound like a lot like private schools, right? Many magnet schools require tests, auditions, transcripts, and laborious application processes for admissions. This makes the school inaccessible for those who aren't prepared enough. Students who are not well-resourced cannot afford the same test prep, the same private art lessons, and students may not have proactive English-speaking parents. Thus, low-income minority students are effectively barred from the opportunity to attend quality magnet schools, despite any school choice notions of opportunity. Unfortunately, under the competitive pressure of privatization, magnet schools are becoming exam schools for the elite. Skimming even occurs at the classroom level. Many studies show that even within integrated magnet schools, the top students, who tend to be white and Asian, cluster in the most advanced classes. Some magnets are programs within traditional public schools, and even magnet schools exist within schools. It goes to show that there are a variety of ways to skim the cream, or cluster the elite, frankly. However, I believe it's wrong to blame people for being elitist, which is often the argument. It's only natural to want what's best for your child. All families want schools that are successful, high-performing, and have low poverty rates. Despite my lofty views on combating education inequality, if I had the opportunity again, I would still choose to go to HSPVA over my neighborhood school. As a result, everyone vies for these spots in the top magnet schools, yet the more advantaged students are more able to secure these spots. Thus, these choice alternatives drive inequality, and these top magnet schools are starting to look a lot like private schools. While certainly a wonderful opportunity for some students like myself, it neglects neighborhood public schools and effectively excludes everybody else. We need strong policy to counteract these natural preferences. Without desegregation efforts to combat the disproportionate advantages, we won't see low-income students of color integrated into public schools. And if these trends continue, education inequality will only get worse. So, what next? Unfortunately, none of these issues I've mentioned, segregation, skimming, privatization, affect magnet schools alone. In fact, all schools are subject to these same issues. But I argue that magnet schools are unique for a solution. They're unique in their history, their original mission of desegregation. Also, they're unique as a happy medium compared to their equally popular school choice counterpart, charters. Let's take a look to compare the two. As you can see, both magnets and charters receive more public and more private funding than traditional neighborhood schools, according to statistics. They also have more flexible curriculums through their themes. But there's one key difference between the two. Magnet schools are unquestionably public, whereas charter schools occupy this nebulous space that's kind of public. Unlike charters, magnets are governed by and held accountable by the government in the same way that traditional public schools are, whereas charters are not. They are truly the happy medium we have been searching for, receiving sympathy from both opponents and advocates of school choice. But to embrace magnets, we must remember to remediate their mistakes and resolve this discrepancy between their original mission and their current effects. We must look beyond our privileged experiences to make equitable policy. We must realize once more, as we saw, desegregation efforts work. We must take back public education for everybody. Thanks. Any questions?
Is there work already being done to try to do what you were talking about, to try and return to this desegregation mission?
Yes, there actually is. There's this famous school in Hartford, Connecticut, where their state Supreme Court kind of redeclared this segregation to be unconstitutional. And so at a state level, and as you know, the education system is very decentralized, so it's mostly the states and less of the federal government now. They've been really pushing for strong policies for desegregation. And while it has some qualms, I have some qualms with it, I think that just having that more official policy is a very important first step.
I'm only marginally familiar with the idea, but could you explain school choice in more detail? There's a lot of different opinions on
That's true. Yeah, I think school choice is a very broad idea, and it's very tied closely to this idea of privatization. But like I said, it's the idea that you're escaping a public school for an alternative, because school choice advocates view these neighborhood traditional public schools as inadequate, and the public system is inadequate to fix them. So it's kind of just looking for other options. Charter schools and magnet schools are just two of the school choice ideas that people have. Other ones include vouchers and other types of schools. Yeah.
So do you know what was different about the way that magnet schools were run during desegregation versus now? How are they able to successfully integrate?
It was the court order. So they were mandated to desegregate.
Right, but so today, right? So I went to a magnet high school, right?
Yeah.
And it was exactly what you're talking about, a bunch of white Asian students plopped in the middle of a mostly Black and Latino school to integrate it, right? But
right.
None of the classes were integrated.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying is, how were they set up? I understand that it was a court order, but how are they physically set up differently than they are today? Was there no entrance exam and anyone could sign up, or how was it that they actually were able to integrate?
Mm-hmm. I think that it was kind of just more effort seen at all different levels of government, whereas now it's not even seen at a federal level really anymore. You can get funding for magnet school without trying to desegregate, whereas then it was both federally mandated and also the state and the district were enforcing these measures to put checks on these magnet schools.
Out of curiosity, do you think if this is more going back to desegregate, do you think it's more doable to start fixing magnet schools at the high school level or the elementary level? Because I know there are magnet schools for all different levels.
Yeah, I actually didn't mention, but most magnet schools are actually elementary schools, which is actually worse because then you're starting this process of skimming so early, which is awful. So I just mentioned high schools because I'm more familiar with them. Yeah, this is definitely something that applies to all different levels of schooling. Yeah?
Where do you see kind of this reinstatement of federal guidelines or court order coming from? Is it going to be a change in legislation, or do you see it more likely as a legal, someone presenting a legal challenge and the Supreme Court deciding that those mandates need to go back in place?
I have little faith in the Supreme Court right now, but okay.
Do you have faith in any of the branches?
Oh,
Sorry, that was very close.
That's a fair assertion. I think that right now the system is so decentralized. Right now, usually states and states have the most power over what the education system will look like within that state. So I think it's going to require individual states to kind of make these more active policy efforts, and then other states to kind of catch on. Yeah?
So I'm just trying to situate this with Betsy DeVos and what she thinks. So she's a voucher queen, right? So she wants people to be able to take their religious, their money to religious schools and stuff like that. So where does the magnet school idea fit in with what she thinks about things?
Yeah, well, because magnet schools are school choice, and she's like the school choice champion, there's actually many quotes of her saying that she supports magnet schools. I mean, I don't know if you can take her word, or politicians' words anymore, but I think that it's worth noting, like, this notion of a happy medium, that magnet schools can leverage both school choice opponents and advocates, and so she would be like an advocate, and I think it would be easier to reel her into supporting magnet schools than it would for, like, having her, like, oh, we need to support neighborhood traditional schools, which is something that she hasn't expressed any interest in doing.
Oh, sure.
Thanks, Kate. So we have an option.